My name is Stephen Lewis, and I'm a second-year MBA student at the Stanford GSB. This report analyzes various industry structures that may result from changing consumer preferences and disruptive technology in the automotive industry, and ultimately attempts to answer the question, will the OEMs get Foxconned? So what would getting Foxconned actually mean? Well, to demonstrate, here are two industry diagrams. On the left is the current automotive industry structure. OEMs produce vehicles to sell to consumers, but actually rely on independent dealers to connect directly with the customers. The OEM's only connection to the consumers is through branding, but that's not insignificant. In this structure, OEMs maintained net margins last year anywhere between 3 and 9%. The consumer electronics industry operates very differently. Foxconn, there at the bottom, is a large contract manufacturer that produces many of our popular devices. However, most of us have never heard of them because they manufacture on behalf of the brands they're more familiar with, such as the Apples and the Sonys of the world. Foxconn has no control over branding, no control over design, and as a result earns very low margins. These are some of the critical characteristics that define contract manufacturing and that we'll attempt to apply to the auto industry in this exercise. In short, the question is there any way that a tech company or a ride-hailing company could come in and drive a wedge between the OEMs and their customers, relegating the OEMs to the role of a low-margin contract manufacturer? Before we jump in, a quick note on methodology. There's 3 potential market structures that I think could put the OEMs in this position, but predicting the future is hard. And to try and base this discussion in facts and logic as much as possible, I'll evaluate each of these scenarios based on underlying assumptions that would need to be true in order for this scenario to come about. If these assumptions seem unreasonable, then logically the scenario is also unreasonable. The first scenario here is the most extreme and the strictest application of the Foxconn analogy. In this scenario, consumers largely abandon personal ownership in favor of shared mobility services like an Uber or a Lyft. As a result, the lion's share of the vehicles that are produced by the auto industry are produced for the purposes of ride-hailing, giving the TNCs power to dictate terms and dictate design specifications, ultimately resulting in very low margins for the OEMs. So the critical assumption required to see this whole industry make this Foxconn transition is a dramatic reduction in personal vehicle ownership. Travis Kalanick, the CEO of Uber, has essentially stated that this is his vision of the future. With the implementation of AVs, some analysts believe the cost of ride-hailing services could fall to as low as 30 cents a mile, which would be below the cost of personal ownership. However, in my opinion, even if this does happen, I think that there's still a large portion of our population for which ride-hailing wouldn't make sense. For example, folks in rural areas, driving enthusiasts, and in particular, many consumers in developing economies who still very strongly view car ownership as a status symbol. Similarly, there was a recent report from the Center of Automotive Research which found that mobility services' negative impact on vehicle sales would be less than 1% of current volume when also factoring in the increase in fleet sales. And therefore, I find this assumption pretty hard to trust. Second, this scenario requires that the TNC customers become completely agnostic to OEM brands and concern themselves only with the brand of their favorite TNC. To me, this seems sort of reasonable. I think that many TNC consumers already feel this way, favoring Lyft or Uber based on a perceived speed or cost advantage and not really making a decision based on whether it's a Ford or a Honda that comes to pick them up. So I think this is reasonable. Third, the scenario requires that independent mobility service providers like an Uber or a Lyft win out over the OEM-sponsored ventures. All these trends have certainly gotten the OEM's attention, and as a result, many of the OEMs are attempting to play in the same space. For example, Daimler owns MyTaxi, GM has a big investment in Lyft, and VW just announced they'd be starting a new ride-hailing brand as well. That said, the independent players have a big lead. It's difficult to say what's going to happen with the implementation of automated vehicles, but I don't think it's unreasonable to believe that the independent TNCs maintain their leadership positions. And finally, TNCs would have to decide to purchase their own vehicle fleets. Of automated vehicles. The TNCs may opt for this path because it would give them the most control over the vehicles and potentially the highest margins. However, it'd be extremely capital intensive and maybe prohibitively so. I think that the recent Daimler-Uber partnership may be indicative of things to come. But I would not consider this type of partnership to be a Foxconning of Daimler, because Daimler would still design and own the product, which are things that Foxconn doesn't do. So that said, overall, it's tough for me to conclude on the ownership structure of the future. However, in summary, I don't think this scenario is very likely, mainly because I don't think that vehicle sales are going to decline significantly enough to send the entire auto industry into contract manufacturing roles. The second scenario is sort of a less extreme version of the first. Instead of the entire industry getting Foxconned, this scenario considers whether maybe one or two OEMs, maybe lagging OEMs, might agree to Foxconn-like roles, especially when faced with declining sales. So for this second scenario, the bottom three assumptions are largely the same, so I won't go through them again. What we're really asking is whether or not a small decline in vehicle sales could impact one OEM disproportionately and could force that OEM into accepting a Foxconn-like role. To be honest, I wouldn't be shocked to see this happen. The OEMs have very high fixed costs, think heavy manufacturing assets, factories, marketing costs, and in order to cover all these costs, they need to keep sales volume up at a certain point. And as discussed earlier, the margins for many OEMs are already pretty low in the single digits. So if an OEM starts to fall behind its peers, maybe because it hasn't been investing in this new technology or because they haven't been investing in these new business models, it may be coerced into accepting lower margins in a contract manufacturing role just to keep the volume up and to keep the factories open. There may also be a bit of a prisoner's dilemma type of pressure impacting a lagging OEM, which might worry that if they don't accept this job producing cars for Uber or for Lyft, then maybe one of their competitors will, and then they'll be sunk. So therefore, in conclusion, I don't think it's unreasonable to believe that a lagging OEM might take a Foxconn-like role if faced with declining sales. In the third Foxconn scenario, a new entrant into the auto industry, like an Apple or a Google, designs a vastly superior in-car experience, similar to the way that Apple disrupted the mobile phone industry with the iPhone. Rather than manufacturing the vehicle themselves, this new entrant contracts with an existing OEM to do it for them. And because the consumers demand this new in-car experience, the new entrant can dictate the design specs and dictate the terms that are very unfavorable to the OEM. Scenario 3 differs from the first two in that it does not rely on consumer shift away from vehicle ownership towards mobility services. Instead, the first assumption is just that a non-OEM, a new entrant, is interested in and able to design a superior vehicle experience. Interest in this has fluctuated a lot recently. It was rumored that Apple and Google were building cars, but now it seems like they're just going to build pieces of that experience. But other companies like Zoox are still thinking about it, and they're thinking about it in radically different ways. So these companies are very secretive, but it's tough to rule this assumption completely out. The second assumption here is that an OEM must be willing to accept the low margins associated with a contract manufacturing role. Automakers can be very proud, and they believe that a century of experience means that they know what consumers want in a vehicle. That said, if faced with declining sales, as we discussed in some of the other scenarios, it's not infeasible that an OEM might be willing to accept this type of low margin work. Hard to say. Either way, I think that this scenario is plausible simply because neither of the assumptions can be concretely disproven. So to sum all this up, I don't think it's very likely that the entire industry sees a radical shift towards contract manufacturing. I just don't think that vehicle ownership will decline significantly enough for that to happen. However, I do think that consumer preferences are changing and new entrants are working on this constantly. And as a result, I think it's tough to completely rule out the idea that one or two OEMs could find themselves in such a role. This concludes my presentation. Thank you all for listening, and special thanks to those who helped provide information for this project. Please feel free to reach out to me with any questions or comments. If you'd like to discuss any of my assumptions or think there's anything I've missed, I'd love to continue the discussion. Furthermore, if you're interested in learning more about some of the topics I discussed, please check out these related reports completed by my classmates. Thanks.